Tech magnate left his wife for a woman half her age and thought he'd leveled up. But when he tried to flaunt his new flame at a high-profile charity gala, the guard stopped him cold. The guest list was strictly VIP, and at the very top, his ex-wife, now the most powerful person in the room. His first mistake that evening was thinking he was still untouchable. Richard Langford stood in front of a full-length mirror in his Manhattan penthouse, adjusting the platinum cufflinks at his wrists, while his new girlfriend posed behind him in a backless ruby-red gown. The skyline of New York shimmered behind them like a city waiting to be claimed, and Richard, now 55, still believed he was the man destined to rule it. His salt and pepper hair was styled immaculately, not a strand out of place. His custom tux hugged his broad shoulders, and every detail in his outfit screamed money and calculated influence. "You look like a man who still owns the world," said his girlfriend, running a manicured hand across his shoulder. She was half his age, bold, magnetic, impossible to overlook. Her name was Sienna Chase, 28, a former lifestyle influencer turned socialite. She moved like someone who knew the cameras were always watching and dressed like every room was her stage. Her lipstick was the same color as her ambition, fire engine red. And tonight, she had one mission: become the most photographed woman in attendance. Richard leaned into the mirror and smirked. "I don't just look like it. I do still own it." He was already picturing the camera flashes, the murmurs among donors, the way heads would turn as he entered with Sienna on his arm. This wasn't just another gala, it was the gala, the most prestigious fundraiser of the year, hosted by the Solstice Foundation, which had recently undergone a mysterious transformation thanks to a massive, anonymous donation. Rumors swirled about a new major benefactor who had single-handedly expanded the organization's reach overnight, though no one seemed to know their identity. Richard didn't care who was on the donor list. He only knew that the room would be filled with billionaires, city officials, media barons, and him. The self-made tech giant who had once ruled these circles with his ex-wife by his side. Back then, people admired them. Now, they envied him. "Ready to make jaws drop?" Sienna asked, touching up her gloss in the mirror's reflection. Richard shot her an approving glance. "You're the perfect upgrade," he said with a grin. "No one's going to miss what came before." He didn't say her name. He never did. At most, she was just his ex, the past, the woman who couldn't keep up. She hadn't been able to handle the pressure, the parties, the press. She'd retreated into charity work, throwing herself into causes like education and mental health initiatives. To Richard, that was just noise. No one made millions saving the world. So he left her. Clean, quiet, no drama. Just swapped her out for someone younger, shinier. And now tonight, he'd returned to that ballroom as he always had. Admired, envied, untouchable. The parties, the spotlight, she'd retreated from it all. Turned her focus to charity work, championing causes like women's shelters and youth outreach. To Richard, it was background noise. Nobody got rich saving the world. So he left her, just like that. No tabloid drama, no screaming fights, just a clean exit and a newer, glossier replacement. And now tonight he'd walk into that ballroom like he always had. Admired, envied, untouchable. The black Maybach pulled up to the marble steps of the Astoria Grand Hotel just after 9 p.m. The valet greeted them with a nervous smile. Richard didn't even make eye contact as he handed over a crisp $100 bill. Cameras began flashing the moment Sienna stepped out, curling herself over Richard's arm like she was made to be there. "Mr. Langford," a photographer shouted. "Look this way." Sienna smiled. Richard raised his chin and offered his signature smirk, the same one that had once earned him magazine covers and seven-figure endorsement deals. He looked the part. He always had. The entry steps were lined with soft white lanterns and guarded by velvet ropes. At the top, two security guards in sharp black suits stood with clipboards and earpieces. Sienna squeezed his arm. "Let's make an entrance." But as they approached, something shifted. One of the guards stepped forward. "Good evening. Your name, please?" Richard nodded, smug. "Richard Langford, +1. The guard scanned the list, checked again, then raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't see your name." Richard blinked. "Check again. It's Richard Langford. I've been coming to this gala for 5 years straight." "I understand, sir," the guard replied, polite but firm. "But your name isn't on the approved guest list." There was a pause. Sienna's lips parted slightly. Richard's jaw tightened. I was personally invited by Gregory Shields. He's chairman of the board. I understand, the guard repeated, but this year's event is strictly by invitation only. We can't admit anyone not on the list. Richard stepped forward. You must not understand who I am. The second guard shifted, hand rising to his earpiece. Sienna let out a nervous laugh. I'm sure this is just a mistake, she said, her voice strained but cheerful. Maybe check the sponsor list or donors. The guard didn't even glance up. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. If you don't have an invitation. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but then his eyes caught movement on the balcony above. She stood there, draped in navy silk. Her hair was swept into a flawless twist. Time hadn't dulled her, it had refined her. She looked untouchable now, poised, radiant, formidable. For a moment, he didn't even recognize her, not because she had changed, but because she wasn't the version of her he remembered. She wasn't by his side anymore. She wasn't in his shadow. She wasn't diminished by his name. She was commanding the room, their eyes locked. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She gave a single, measured nod, slow and deliberate, then turned her back and walked away. Richard's breath hitched. Sienna turned toward him. Richard, what the hell is going on? He didn't answer. Couldn't. Something dropped in his chest. Something he didn't know how to name. The guard cleared his throat. Sir, please step aside for the other guests. Richard didn't move. Behind them, a new couple arrived, elegantly dressed, laughing softly. They were admitted without hesitation. They were on the list. Richard stared at the doors, still trying to process what had just happened. He had been dismissed, erased. And everyone had seen it. Sienna tugged at his sleeve. Let's go. We're not standing out here like losers. He let her lead him back down the steps, toward the waiting car. The valet pulled up with the black Mercedes, returned the keys without a word. But even as they climbed into the vehicle, Richard's mind was somewhere else. The image of her nodding from the balcony replayed in his head, burned there like a permanent scar. That night, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man in control. And though he didn't know it yet, that single moment would be the first fracture in everything he believed he'd built. Imagine showing up somewhere, certain you still owned the room, only to realize you weren't even on the guest list. What would you do if your ex was suddenly the one running the show? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like if you're hooked, and subscribe to see how this unfolds. And hey, if you're enjoying the stories, show us some love in the chat. No pressure, just appreciation. The silence inside the car was louder than the applause still echoing from the Astoria's ballroom. Richard sat stiffly in the back seat, fingers drumming on the leather armrest. Sienna scrolled through her phone, her face lit only by the cold blue glow of the screen. She hadn't said a word since they were turned away. For the first time since he'd met her, she didn't seem to enjoy being the center of attention, not even the cameras still snapping as they pulled away. What the hell was that? She finally muttered, eyes still fixed on her phone. Richard didn't respond. He kept replaying it in his head, every detail, every beat, from the red carpet to the velvet rope to the guards who didn't flinch when he raised his voice. But mostly, he saw her. The woman in the navy silk gown, the ex-wife, Lena. The same woman he once described as forgettable. The woman he once believed could never stand on her own. She hadn't waved, hadn't smiled, hadn't spoken, just a nod. Subtle, controlled, devastating. She planned this, Sienna said, jolting him back. That was personal. That wasn't some list mistake. She did that on purpose. He looked at her then, his expression unreadable. His voice, lower than usual. I know. Sienna scoffed. So what are you gonna do? Just let her humiliate you like that? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window as they drove through Manhattan. His reflection in the glass looked older, smaller. The man staring back at him wasn't the titan he'd spent years crafting. He looked like someone who had finally come face to face with the cost of underestimation. She had taken a room that should have belonged to him and turned it into her stage. And he hadn't even seen it coming. That wasn't a woman grieving. That was a woman who had learned how to build power without raising her voice. The car stopped in front of his luxury building. He didn't move. Sienna, clearly annoyed, slammed the door and didn't wait for him in the elevator. Maybe she expected him to chase her. to soothe her ego with the compliments he usually fed her when the cameras weren't around. But Richard stayed in the car a moment longer, staring at his hands. They weren't just empty, they were foreign, unfamiliar, as if they no longer belonged to the man who once believed he could hold the world in his grip. They felt empty. Upstairs, the penthouse was as pristine as ever, cold, perfect, lifeless. The kind of place meant to be admired, not lived in. Designer furniture, imported marble, curated artwork, everything picked by a stylist who understood what wealthy people wanted other wealthy people to think of them. He walked past it all without a glance, poured himself a drink, stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The New York skyline stretched before him. The same view that once felt like it belonged to him. Now it felt distant, indifferent. He could still see the guests entering the gala. Some had looked surprised, others amused. Most were too polite to stare as security turned him away. But the whispers had started. He knew how this game worked. They wouldn't talk about the millions he'd donated in previous years or the foundations he'd launched. They'd talk about the balcony, about her, about the nod. He took a slow sip of his drink, jaw tightening. She hadn't just recovered, she had outplayed him. The next morning he started making calls. First, to Gregory Shields, chairman of the Solstice Foundation board. Gregory's assistant picked up. "Mr. Shields is unavailable at the moment. Can I take a message?" Richard didn't leave one. He hung up. He called again at noon. Same response. Again at Ford. No answer. He was being shut out. He rang his former PR firm next. "We need to release a statement," he said. "Something about a scheduling conflict. Say I chose not to attend." There was hesitation on the other end. "Mr. Langford, photos of you at the entrance have already surfaced. I'm not sure that narrative will hold." He slammed the phone down. Later that evening he paced the living room, still in yesterday's dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, tie abandoned on the couch. Sienna had texted him once, "Are we still doing dinner, or are you sulking?" He didn't reply. He stood at the bar, poured another drink. This one burned worse than the last. Across the city, the gala was still trending. Images of Lena, the woman he had once dismissed as too quiet, too soft, were everywhere. She'd been photographed speaking with senators, laughing with CEOs, addressing the crowd from the podium like she was born for it. Her name was now tied to the foundation's largest ever donation. She wasn't just on the board, she was the board. He turned on the TV just in time to catch a recap on a local news station. There she was, standing confidently in front of a massive Solstice backdrop. Lena Monroe, formerly Lena Langford, the anchor said, has emerged as the lead donor behind the Solstice Foundation's expansion. Sources confirm she was instrumental in restructuring the organization's leadership and driving its new public image. Richard froze. Monroe? She had dropped his name, not out of malice, not for revenge, but for something more unnerving. Independence. A clean break. A signal that she was no longer tethered to him, not even in name. He hadn't expected that. Not because he believed she needed his name, but because, deep down, some primitive part of him had assumed she'd always be linked to him somehow, even just through a last name. She had severed even that. And she'd done it publicly. He changed the channel. But her image stayed in his mind. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the past 24 hours looping in his head like a broken reel. His thoughts circled like vultures. Regret, disbelief, something closer to shame than he was willing to name. At one point, he got up, went to the drawer where he'd stashed the old framed photos that used to sit on his desk. Wedding shots, vacation candids, holiday cards. He hadn't looked at them in months, maybe years. He pulled out one, New Year's Eve, years ago. Lena caught mid-laugh, mouth open, eyes half-closed in joy. He was looking at her, mid-smile. Back then, the world had felt full, unbreakable. For a second, the image felt alien, like a moment from someone else's life. The next morning, he shaved, got dressed, and walked into his office building with the kind of confidence that only looked real from the outside. His assistant looked up at him, wide-eyed. "Mr. Langford, good morning." "Get me Gregory Shields on the line," he said, tossing his coat over the back of the chair. "Or someone from the Solstice Foundation board. Anyone who'll pick up." She hesitated. "Sir, there's been a memo." "What kind of memo?" "Apparently, the foundation has decided to no longer pursue partnerships with any corporate entities tied to ongoing litigation. Richard frowned. What litigation? She looked down at her tablet. The Atlantic Heights development. It's being reopened for environmental compliance violations. His face hardened. That project had been cleared months ago. That's absurd, but it wasn't. Lena had once served on the city's development oversight committee before stepping away. She still had connections, influence. Now she had visibility and funding. He sank into his chair, and the realization crept in slowly, like a slow leak through concrete. This hadn't just been about a gala. This wasn't a party snub. She had taken back control, and not just of her image or her name or her dignity. She was rewriting the story, crafting a new narrative, one where he wasn't the protagonist, not even the antagonist, one where he simply didn't matter anymore. And for the first time since Richard Langford built his empire, one calculated deal, one media splash at a time, he felt something he couldn't escape with money, charm, or power. Irrelevance. And the worst part? She hadn't needed to say a word. All she did was nod. But the undoing had started long before the balcony, long before the velvet rope and the closed door. It had begun in quieter moments. At first, it looked like triumph. It looked like confidence. But even in the early days of Richard Langford's so-called success, the cracks had already started forming. Hairline fractures beneath the surface. Cracks he had been too arrogant or too blind to see. It began with the late nights, not the kind consumed by deadlines or deals, the kind where he simply didn't go home. He'd tell Lena he had another investor dinner, another emergency board meeting, and she, always calm, always gracious, would nod and wish him a productive evening. She never questioned him. Not then. She was used to the grind. She'd helped him build it from the ground up. What she didn't know was that those evenings weren't spent in boardrooms or steakhouse private rooms. They were spent in the dim corners of cocktail lounges, where red dresses replaced spreadsheets and compliments replaced contracts. He met Sienna in one of those lounges. She wasn't like the women he met at charity galas or tech summits. She was loud, unfiltered, and refreshingly indifferent to his money or resume. She told him she didn't care about his net worth, though she definitely Googled him the moment she got home. Richard always liked a challenge, and Sienna played the role to perfection. She made him feel young again, or at least like someone who could still be desired. More than that, she made him feel wanted, or so he thought. But beneath the thrill, something quieter gnawed at him. A fear he couldn't name. Not of being alone, but of becoming invisible. He saw it in boardrooms where younger CEOs spoke faster, dressed leaner. He felt it at parties where the music got louder, the conversations shorter. Sienna made him feel seen. And maybe that's why he held on. Back at home, Lena had been shifting too, though her transformation was quieter. She stepped back from the glitz of corporate galas and networking nights, instead pouring her focus into the charities she'd supported for years. Behind the scenes, she spent hours coordinating with shelters, leading food drives, mentoring college students through nonprofit partnerships. Richard noticed, barely. From a distance, he found it quaint. He'd always admired her grace. But somewhere along the way, he started to resent her for choosing substance over spectacle. The woman who once turned heads now seemed to drift through rooms like mist, just out of reach. They spoke less. Dinner conversations shrank. She stopped asking where he was going, and he stopped caring where she had been. Their silence no longer felt neutral. It felt like armor, an invisible wall growing thicker with every unspoken word. At first, the silence was mutual. Then it became tactical. One night, Richard walked in after midnight, tie loosened, whiskey on his breath. Lena was in the study, reviewing funding proposals. She looked up, but didn't greet him. "You're home early," she said flatly. He didn't reply. He poured himself a glass of water at the bar cart and leaned against the doorway. "You're always in here these days," he said. "Don't you miss us?" Lena turned a page. "I miss the version of us that used to talk." He let out a bitter chuckle. "That's rich, coming from you. You've basically become a nun." She looked up at him, finally. "And you've turned our marriage into a stage set for your ego." "I never asked you to change," she added, her voice steady. "But you did, and I'm tired of pretending I don't see it." Her words hit something he didn't expect. It was the first real fight they'd had in months, not because there hadn't been reasons before, but because they'd both been avoiding the one thing neither wanted to say out loud. There was nothing left between them. Nothing but shared property and the fragile performance of a relationship. A few weeks later, Richard left for a weekend in Miami. He said it was to court new investors. He didn't mention that Sienna would be there, and Lena didn't ask. When he came back, she wasn't at the door. She didn't even come downstairs. There was a note on the kitchen counter. "Dinner's in the fridge. I have an early meeting tomorrow." He read it twice, not because it surprised him, but because it didn't. She had always been poised, always composed. But now, that calm felt less like dignity, and more like distance. Something had shifted, and he could feel it, even in her silence. It was around this time that Lena started using her maiden name again. Quietly, at first, on emails, in nonprofit correspondence. She never made a public announcement. Lena never confronted Richard about her decision. She simply began reclaiming parts of herself, pieces she had once handed over in the name of being Mrs. Langford. Richard noticed the first time she received formal mail addressed to Lena Monroe. He held the envelope in his hand for a full minute before setting it on the counter without a word. That night, he called Sienna from his office. "I'm getting out," he said. "This marriage is over." Sienna, who had waited for this moment like a cat perched above a mousehole, purred into the phone. About time. The divorce moved quickly. Lena didn't contest a thing. She didn't demand more assets, didn't drag it out with dramatics, didn't cry. She just agreed. And that unsettled Richard more than he cared to admit. He'd expected resistance, bitterness, maybe even tears. Instead, she signed the papers with the same quiet composure she'd always carried, and then she vanished. But not before one final exchange. It was brief. They were standing in the entryway of the townhouse they once shared, the last few boxes packed, the space hollow with silence. Richard looked at her, holding his keys, his coat draped over one arm. "You'll be fine," he said, meant it as a peace offering. Lena met his eyes. "I already am." That was it. No dramatic exit, no slammed door. Just a truth, spoken plainly, with a calm that made Richard feel, for the first time, like he was no longer a part of the story. And yet, in the weeks that followed, he told himself he'd won. That he'd traded the dead weight of a fading marriage for someone younger, flashier. That he was free. That Lena's silence was a gift. But the cracks had already formed, not just in the marriage, but in the narrative he'd built for himself. Because for all his arrogance, Richard had underestimated something real, the strength of the woman he thought he'd left behind. And somewhere far from his glass penthouse and curated social world, Lena Monroe was beginning again. Not in rage, not in desperation, but in silence, in strategy, in strength. And one day, not long from now, that silence would echo louder than anything he'd ever constructed. Richard Langford stepped into his new life like a man entering a penthouse suite. Confident, poised, certain the view would always work in his favor. In the weeks after the divorce, he moved fast. His lawyer wrapped the process swiftly. No media frenzy followed. No splashy headlines, no dramatic photos, no courtroom spectacle. Lena, ever composed, ensured it. She signed quietly, made no public appearances, and disappeared. And to Richard, silence meant surrender. He saw it as a clean break, a power play, a man shedding an old skin to embrace something new. Sienna, radiant and wild, was on his arm now. Wherever they went, heads turned. She wore couture like she was born in it, like confidence had always come with the label. And Richard? He soaked in the attention like it was sunlight. He told himself he had traded restraint for thrill, elegance for energy, loyalty for lust, and that it had been the right call. At first it was intoxicating. He and Sienna were invited to every launch, every rooftop soiree, every private tasting and gallery preview. Her laughter was loud, frequent, engineered to be heard. Cameras followed them everywhere. Magazines started running features. Richard Langford and Sienna Chase, the couple redefining power and style. He didn't care that she had no background in business, no equity in any of his companies. She was a statement, and Richard loved statements. His penthouse, once quiet, curated, dignified, became a showroom of excess. Stylists cycled in weekly. Caterers rotated through themed dinner parties. Every room bore the imprint of some brand's aesthetic. And Richard, for a time, believed he'd stepped into the better version of his life. But under the surface of that luxury, shadows flickered. Small signs of unease he drowned with another pour of wine, another flattering headline. He stopped hearing from people who used to call Lena a friend. At first, he didn't notice. The couple from the art district stopped inviting him to their garden gala. The woman from the museum board returned his call with a vague excuse. One by one, the quiet ties began to loosen. Still, Richard chalked it up to loyalty shifts, casualties of divorce. People pick sides, he told himself. Let them. But something deeper was unraveling. Lena hadn't just walked away from the marriage. She'd walked away from the world he thought they would always share. And she hadn't taken bitterness with her. She had taken dignity, credibility, influence. She hadn't shouted or posted cryptic messages. She hadn't chased sympathy. She vanished, with purpose. And that silence, it stretched. Richard's first real sense of unease came during an interview with a prominent lifestyle network. The interviewer, a sleek woman named Nicole, smiled brightly through most of the segment, until the final question. "You've become quite the face of luxury in recent months," she said. "What do you think defines your transformation since the divorce?" He hesitated, half a second too long. Sienna shifted next to him. He recovered. "Clarity," he said. "When you walk away from something that's no longer working, you gain perspective." Nicole tilted her head. "And Lena, she was a big part of your public image for years. Any thoughts on how she's doing?" The energy in the room shifted. Richard smiled, his practiced smile, the one that smoothed over discomfort. "She's doing what she's always done. Quiet work behind the scenes. I'm sure she's fine." But Nicole's expression held something unreadable. A flicker of knowing. "Actually," she said, "we recently received word that she's made a major donation to the Solstice Foundation. Some are calling her the silent force behind its new direction." A pause. Richard's smile froze. "Is that so?" The segment ended shortly after. But that moment replayed in his mind later that night as Sienna scrolled through tagged photos from a dinner event on her phone. Richard sat in silence. He only half listened. His mind drifted, back to Lena, to her silence, to the way people had slowly stopped calling, and to the realization that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't disappeared. She had simply stepped into a different circle. Still, he pushed the thought away. That night, he hosted a party at the penthouse, celebrating a tech acquisition that would triple his company's media holdings. The space was flooded with music, laughter, and the scent of champagne that cost more than most monthly rents. Sienna was magnetic, dressed in something sheer and glittering, effortlessly captivating the room. And Richard, ever the showman, lifted his glass high. "To reinvention," he bellowed. The crowd cheered. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and yet at the back of the room near the floor-to-ceiling windows he felt something. Not guilt. He didn't believe in guilt. Just an ache, a hollow weight. A space no applause could fill, a silence that settled deeper than noise could cover. Even the best performances lose their thrill when the audience has moved on. It all came to a head weeks later when he saw her name again. Not Lena Langford, Lena Monroe. It was printed at the bottom of a Forbes Women editorial about influential private philanthropists reshaping the future of American charitable giving. She wasn't the subject. She was the author, a thought piece, insightful, sharp, personal. She wrote about building in silence, about letting actions speak louder than platforms, about legacy. There was no mention of Richard, no bitterness, just quiet power, like steel under silk. He read it 3 times. Then he set the magazine down and stared out at the skyline, the same view he once found exhilarating. Now it felt far away, like a city he no longer quite belonged to. Sienna walked in moments later, mid-rant, about a PR manager who had totally screwed up her brand messaging. She dropped onto the sofa beside him, legs across his lap, waving her phone. He nodded, not really hearing her. She was still talking when he stood and walked to the bar. The ice in the glass cracked softly, barely a sound, but loud enough to echo in the room's stillness. The silence between them, once hidden under passion, began to settle. Heavy, like fog. The divorce had looked like freedom. It had felt like victory. But now, in the stillness of a high-rise built to impress strangers, Richard began to feel something else. Not quite regret. Not yet. But close. Across the city, Lena Monroe woke before sunrise most mornings. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. There was peace in that early stillness. A calm that filled her new apartment like a quiet promise. She no longer lived in a 3-level townhouse with a doorman who bowed too often, or ceilings too high to feel like home. To hear your own breath. Her new apartment was smaller, brighter, simpler. 2 bedrooms, tall windows, soft gray walls she'd painted herself, and a balcony just big enough for a chair and a cup of tea. But it was hers. A space not meant to impress, but to exhale. A place where every corner whispered of freedom earned the hard way. Every detail, every choice, every item of furniture carried a story she had written on her own. Not as someone's wife. When Lena left Richard, she didn't run. She didn't cry. She packed, precisely. 1 week, 27 boxes, 5 suitcases. She only took what she needed: some books, her late mother's piano, her grandmother's tea set, and a few pieces of art she had collected through the years. She left behind the designer gowns, the silk robes, the jewelry she used to wear to match the image of Mrs. Langford. It wasn't revenge, it was clarity. She was done dressing for someone else's reflection. At first the silence felt suffocating. The days moved like fog, heavy, slow. But she didn't call anyone. She didn't fill the quiet with distractions. She just sat with it, letting the stillness press against her until it softened, until it became a part of her rather than something to fear. And eventually she started to hear her own voice again. It came in small moments. The sound of a paintbrush on canvas, laughter from the park down the street, the beat of her heart quickening when she opened an email from a nonprofit director she hadn't spoken to in months. "We're expanding. We need help. Would you consider joining our advisory board?" She said yes. Then came another and another. A women's advocacy network, a housing initiative, a maternal health foundation. Her calendar began to fill again, not with galas or benefit dinners, but with meetings in community centers, in cafes, and sometimes over Zoom from her kitchen. Conversations grounded in change, not pretense. Her name started appearing again, in footnotes, in thank you sections, in press release credits, never at the center, always near the engine, exactly where she wanted to be. Behind the scenes, Lena was rebuilding, but not her image, her influence. She met quietly with CEOs, policy advisors, and philanthropists, not the ones chasing headlines, the ones building legacies, the kind of women Richard had once overlooked, choosing instead headline-ready wives and PR-friendly partnerships, were now inviting Lena into circles where power didn't require applause. One afternoon, she found herself across from Evelyn Burke, a seasoned strategist who had led more nonprofit mergers than anyone else in the Northeast. They talked for hours, over mint tea and garden salads. The conversation circled around vision, legacy, and the value of staying invisible just long enough to outgrow people's expectations. The letter had reminded her, her silence had never been weakness. It had been a choice, a temporary measure. Now her voice returned, with purpose, with precision. And people noticed. They didn't always say it aloud, but when Lena walked into a room, the energy shifted. Her presence spoke for her now, louder than any podium ever could. One of her closest colleagues, Deirdre Ellis, a former DC policy advisor turned strategist, said it best during a late-night session over black coffee and notepads full of scribbles. "You don't just hold the room, Lena, you redefine it. That's rarer than people realize." Lena had smiled, not out of pride, but because it was true. Not long ago, she had wondered whether she'd ever be taken seriously again. Now she didn't need to wonder. The results spoke louder than any headline. Under her guidance, the Solstice Foundation hadn't just expanded its funding, it had overhauled its entire model. Equity, access, long-term impact. The kind of work that didn't trend on social media, but rewrote futures, quietly and permanently. And yet, in those soft-spoken moments where her impact whisper fell between boardroom walls, she felt something stronger than validation. She felt rooted, purposeful, unbreakable, and still, she kept the letter. Even as her name began surfacing in conversations she wasn't even in. Even as reporters reached out and she declined their calls. Even as younger women emailed her asking for mentorship. How to lead without shrinking, how to sit at a table without losing yourself. The letter stayed, tucked inside a notebook in her bottom drawer. Some days she would take it out, not to read, just to feel it. Like running your fingers over a scar that no longer hurt. Then one morning, just days before the gala, Lena opened the notebook and reread the letter. One last time. She expected it to sting, to summon all the old pain. But it didn't. She read the words with distance, with gratitude. Even the woman who had written them wasn't angry anymore. In their place there was clarity, a steady flame of conviction that no longer needed nourishment from anger or indignation. She was resolved. Lena smiled, tore the letter from the spiral binding and walked to the fireplace. Without pause, she lit a match, held it to the edge of the page, and watched it burn. Each sentence turned to smoke, each confession into ash. When it was gone, she stood for a long moment, her reflection flickering in the glass. That afternoon, she finalized the gala's floor plan, reviewed the security protocols, approved the final guest roster. When her assistant asked if there were any names to remove, she said only one: Richard Langford. No drama, no note, no confrontation, just a name, quietly erased. And in doing so, she closed a chapter no letter ever could. Closure. On her terms. It was the kind of night that made the city feel alive. Towering glass buildings shimmered under a violet sky. From the street below, the Sterling Hotel glowed like a monument to wealth and status. Luxury sedans pulled up in rhythmic succession. Doors opened to reveal beaded gowns and precision-tailored tuxedos. The red carpet had been laid hours earlier. Velvet ropes. Camera crews. The Solstice Foundation's annual gala was, as always, the talk of the city. But this year, it carried a different energy, an air of mystery. No leaked donor list, no CEO had publicly claimed the event, and that only heightened its allure. Richard Langford stepped out of the black Mercedes. She had once fought just to get a place on the agenda. Now she shaped policy proposals, rewrote campaign objectives, and even had a hand in choosing the gala's venue, its tone, and its guest list. Her only condition? No public mention of her name. No articles, no press quotes, no spotlight. No one outside the inner circle knew she was behind the transformation. But inside the circle, everyone knew, and their loyalty belonged to her. The gala wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about dominance. It was about presence. Richard would never see it coming, not because Lena was hiding, but because he never thought to look. He assumed she'd faded, that she had stepped quietly into the background, that he had traded her in for something younger, shinier, better. But Lena had never needed the noise. She had only learned the value of being underestimated. And while no one was watching, she built a fortress beneath their feet. By the time the invitations went out, her name appeared nowhere. But her signature was on everything. The color palette, the floor plan, the donor tiers, the security details. Every guest had been vetted, every seat strategically selected, and when the final guest list was printed, she ran her finger down the names, carefully. Richard Langford wasn't on it. She paused, then nodded once, and just like that, the circle closed. Richard had always believed appearances were everything. Not just the suits, the polished speech, the curated charm, but the projection of control, of momentum, of success. He'd built his adult life around the illusion of perfection, sculpting his image with the same precision he used to grow his portfolio. In his world, there was no room for flaws, only finish. But something was shifting. It started with invitations. At first, his assistant blamed it on timing, on the seasonal lull. But Richard noticed. Events where he used to be a guaranteed name now passed without him. The downtown art gala, the annual development forum, a silent auction hosted by the governor's wife. These weren't just parties, they were battlegrounds for influence. And quietly, Richard was no longer in the center. He brushed it off. At first, people were just jealous, he told himself, uncomfortable with how quickly he had moved on from Lena. And Sienna? Well, she was an acquired taste. She didn't have Lena's grace, her balance, her quiet intuition, but she had edge, spark. She said things that made people laugh or flinch. Either way, she got attention, and Richard liked that, at least in the beginning. But then came the missteps. At a benefit dinner for educational reform, Sienna interrupted the keynote speaker with a joke about private school bribes. No one laughed. Richard smiled tightly, but he noticed the way the couple seated beside them exchanged glances, and how the foundation director subtly avoided their table for the rest of the evening. At a luxury brunch hosted by a premier real estate group, Sienna arrived in a dress cut 2 inches too high and made a casual remark about flipping distressed properties for fun. Later, one of the hosts posted a group photo from the event. Everyone at their table was tagged, except Richard and Sienna. He said nothing. He never did. because to say something meant admitting that things weren't perfect. And Richard didn't do imperfect. But the signs multiplied. At work, a longtime partner quietly pulled out of a joint venture, citing brand alignment concerns. A veteran client asked to shift meetings to another executive. Richard's name appeared less frequently in internal communications, memo summaries, briefings, newsletters. He wasn't losing money yet, but he was losing something more elusive, reputation. And still, Sienna didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care. She filled his penthouse with influencers and creators, filming content, staging collaborations, hawking lifestyle brands. She launched a skincare line without any real experience, posting sponsored reels of herself holding jars of cream in their designer kitchen. "I'm building something too," she said one morning while unboxing a PR package, the ring light propped beside the stove. "You get it, right?" Richard nodded, sipping coffee from a mug that read, "Hustle harder." He hadn't bought it. He spent more and more time at the office. Not working, exactly, just being there. Reviewing spreadsheets that didn't need review, rewatching old investor decks, staring out the window. At home, the silence he once tried to escape became the very thing he missed. Sienna always had music on, something synthetic, loud. She was always filming, always posing, always in motion. One night, after a long board meeting where his opinions had been quietly overruled, Richard wandered into the guest room. He hadn't stepped foot in there for weeks. It was Sienna's studio now. Tripods, ring lights, piles of clothes tagged for return after their photo cycles. He stood among them like a stranger in a showroom, letting his fingers brush the edge of a pink sequin blazer. Then his eyes landed on a photo. Not framed, just resting on a side table. One of the publicity stills from their first gala together. Sienna smiling like a movie star. Richard looked distracted, or maybe tired. He couldn't tell anymore. He picked it up, turned it over, scrawled in black marker on the back, "The rise begins here." He stared at the words. Whose rise? He left the room without touching anything else. The next morning he asked his assistant to cancel the Solstice Foundation check-in. "It's not relevant anymore," he said. But she hesitated. "Sir, the foundation's pivot is drawing serious attention. They're merging with several advocacy groups now, and their donor base has tripled. They've become influential." Richard said nothing. He just waved her off. But the word stuck. Influential. The world was shifting again, and he wasn't at the center of it anymore. Then came the storm. Online, at first. Subtle. A tweet from a small-time commentator. Imagine showing up to a high-profile gala uninvited. The arrogance of thinking your name still guarantees you a seat? No names, just tone. And that tone traveled. A whisper turned into a murmur. An influencer posted a reaction video to a blurry shot of Richard at the gala's velvet rope, security standing firm. Caption: "When your ex owns the building." Richard wanted to deny it, to sue someone, to bury the entire story. But he knew better. Once a narrative gains traction, you don't steer it, you chase it. And the harder you chase, the weaker you look. So he stayed silent and watched. He considered calling Lena. Why? He didn't quite know. For clarity? Closure? But she wouldn't answer. Not because she was cruel, she had never been cruel, but because she'd already moved on. That night, he sat alone in his home office, dimly lit, the city buzzing just outside. Sienna was away, on a press trip she'd arranged with a shampoo brand. He opened a folder on his computer labeled personal. Inside were photos, vacations, holidays, launches. But one image stood out. Lena, at the edge of a rooftop event. Not looking at the camera. Not smiling. Not posing. Just present. Completely. Richard stared at that photo for a long time. Then he closed the folder, shut down the screen, poured himself a glass of scotch, and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cold. The city hummed below him. And for the first time, the image of who he thought he was began to flicker, like a reel burning under its own heat. The letter had been written on a stormy Thursday, long before the gala, long before the nod. It had never been sent. Lena Monroe kept it folded in the back of a worn leather notebook, its pages slightly smudged from fingers that lingered too long. She had written it in one sitting, curled on her old sofa, the thunder outside echoing the swirl of her thoughts. Feelings she hadn't realized still waited under the surface of her polished calm. The letter had no greeting. No, "Dear Richard," no warm-up. Just a beginning. Like someone walking into a room they used to live in, and speaking as if they'd never left. You'll never understand what it cost me to stay silent." Her handwriting was steady, but the pressure of her pen told a different story. The words were carved deep, like truth etched into something permanent. She didn't write it to forgive him or to accuse him. She wrote it to release what had lived inside her chest for far too long. Anger, yes, but more than that, grief, clarity, and finally, peace. She described the moments he had never noticed. The dinner where she sat across from him in silence while he scrolled through his phone. The nights he came home late, hours past what was acceptable, and smelled like cologne that wasn't hers. The public smiles she wore like armor. The private battles she fought alone in rooms that used to feel like home. But it wasn't just betrayal she put into words. It was erosion of dreams, of respect, of identity. Piece by piece, she had watched herself disappear inside a marriage where silence was expected and presence was mistaken for weakness. "You made me feel invisible," she wrote. "And then you convinced yourself I had disappeared." She paused at that line, let the ink dry, then continued. "But I wasn't gone. I was watching, learning, building. You thought leaving me was your victory. What you didn't see was that it gave me space to remember who I was before you decided who I should be." She didn't name Sienna. There was no need. Lena had never been one for comparisons. The wound had never been about the replacement. It was about the ease with which she had been discarded, and the freedom that finally came when she stopped waiting for an apology that would never arrive. The letter ended with a truth she never intended to say out loud. "I don't need you to understand me. I just needed to remember that I do." Then she folded it, slipped it into the back of her leather notebook. Not because she wanted to keep it, but because she wasn't quite ready to let it go. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a keepsake. It was proof that her voice had always been there, even when she hadn't used it. In the weeks that followed, Lena let the words in that letter guide her, not out of anger, but with intention. She asked different questions in meetings, took longer pauses before saying yes, spoke less, listened more. Her influence grew sharper, less about pleasing, more about conviction. When the Solstice Foundation board began discussing its next strategic expansion, Lena didn't raise her hand. She waited until they turned to her. And when they did, she didn't ask for a vote. She outlined a vision, quietly, confidently, without apology. The letter had reminded her, her silence had never been weakness. It had been a choice, a temporary measure. Now her voice returned with purpose, with precision, and people noticed. They didn't always say it aloud. But when Lena walked into a room, the energy shifted. Her presence spoke for her now, louder than any podium ever could. One of her closest colleagues, Deirdre Ellis, a former DC policy advisor turned strategist, said it best during a late-night session over black coffee and notepads full of scribbles. "You don't just hold the room, Lena. You redefine it. That's rarer than people realize." Lena had smiled, not out of pride, but because it was true. Not long ago, she had wondered whether she'd ever be taken seriously again. Now, she didn't need to wonder. The results spoke louder than any headline. Under her guidance, the Solstice Foundation hadn't just expanded its funding, it had overhauled its entire model. Equity, access, long-term impact. The kind of work that didn't trend on social media, but rewrote futures, quietly and permanently. And still, she kept the letter. Even as her name began surfacing in conversations she wasn't even in. Even as reporters reached out and she declined their calls. Even as younger women emailed her, asking for mentorship, how to lead without shrinking, how to sit at a table without losing yourself. The letter stayed, tucked inside a notebook in her bottom drawer. Some days she would take it out, not to read, just to feel it, like running your fingers over a scar that no longer hurt. Then one morning, just days before the gala, Lena opened the notebook and reread the letter. One last time. She expected it to sting, to summon all the old pain. But it didn't. She read the words with distance, with gratitude. Even the woman who had written them wasn't angry anymore. She was resolved. Lena smiled, tore the letter from the spiral binding, and walked to the fireplace. Without pause, she lit a match, held it to the edge of the page, and watched it burn. Each sentence turned to smoke, each confession into ash. When it was gone, she stood for a long moment, her reflection flickering in the glass. That afternoon, she finalized the gala's floor plan, reviewed the security protocols, approved the final guest roster. When her assistant asked if there were any names to remove, she said only one: Richard Langford. No drama, no note, no confrontation, just a name quietly erased. And in doing so, she closed a chapter no letter ever could. Closure. On her terms. It was the kind of night that made the city feel alive. Towering glass buildings shimmered under a violet sky. From the street below, the Sterling Hotel glowed like a monument to wealth and status. Luxury sedans pulled up in rhythmic succession. Doors opened to reveal beaded gowns and precision-tailored tuxedos. The red carpet had been laid hours earlier. Velvet ropes, camera crews. The Solstice Foundation's annual gala was, as always, the talk of the city. But this year, it carried a different energy. An air of mystery. No leaked donor list. No CEO had publicly claimed the event, and that only heightened its allure. Richard Langford stepped out of the black Mercedes. Like a man returning to his throne, Richard adjusted the lapels of his deep navy tuxedo, one hand resting lightly on Sienna's slim waist. She wore a champagne-colored gown with a plunging neckline and rhinestone cuffs. Her blonde hair was swept into a sleek bun, her crystal heels catching the light like they had something to prove. Together they looked like wealth personified, like power, like a couple who expected to be seen. Except no one greeted them. Not yet. Sienna smoothed the front of her dress, eyes scanning the crowd with the kind of smile meant to be photographed. "This place is crawling with cameras," she said brightly, to no one in particular. "We should have walked slower, given them time to catch us." But Richard was already moving, eyes set on the steps leading to the hotel's grand entrance. He didn't need the fanfare. His presence was the statement, or so he believed. At the top, 2 security guards stepped forward. Same uniforms, same clipboard, same stance. "Name, please," one said. Richard offered his polished half-smile. "Richard Langford, +1. The guard looked down, scanned the list, then met his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir, your name isn't on the guest list." Richard's brow furrowed. "That must be a mistake. I've sponsored this event in the past, attended 3 years running." "I understand, sir," the guard replied, calm but firm. "But this year's gala is strictly invitation only. We can't admit anyone not on the approved list." There it was, the exact same phrasing, like a script. And just like that, the memory came crashing back, the last gala. Lena, standing above him, untouched, unbothered. The memory sliced through his composure like a chill, an involuntary tremor flickering through his chest. He cleared his throat, stood straighter, leaned in. "I know the woman behind this event," he said. "Just check again." But the guard didn't even blink. "Sir, I've checked. You're not on the list." Sienna scoffed. "Do you even know who he is?" Her tone was sharp, indignant. "This is ridiculous." Richard opened his mouth to speak again until he saw her. Not on a balcony this time. Inside, framed perfectly behind the massive glass wall of the ballroom, Lena, surrounded by 2 board members in suits. Her gown was navy again, darker, with intricate gold embroidery tracing her sleeves and neckline. Quiet elegance, hair swept to one side, eyes calm. She didn't look his way, or maybe she did and chose not to react. He stared. His hand unconsciously slipped from Sienna's waist. She looked like royalty, and for a fleeting, infuriating second, he hated that he noticed, hated that he remembered, hated that she belonged here now, and he did not. Sienna turned to follow his gaze. His gaze stayed fixed. "Is that your ex-wife?" Sienna asked. He didn't answer. Inside, Lena began to walk, with intention, with command, not toward him. Toward the main stage, now being prepped for opening remarks. She passed clusters of guests, senators, CEOs, cultural leaders, and each one greeted her with the kind of warmth Richard hadn't seen in years. She wasn't just there. She was the center. Then, as if she felt the weight of his stare, Lena turned. Their eyes met through the ballroom glass. She didn't smile, didn't sneer, didn't flinch. She just stood, watching him, as if seeing someone she used to know. Someone who once mattered, but didn't anymore. Then slowly she turned away and walked on. Sienna's voice cut through the silence. "Are you seriously going to let this happen again?" Richard felt the heat rush to his face. "It's not over," he muttered. He stepped forward, toward the guard. "Get someone from the board. I want to speak to whoever's in charge." The guard didn't move. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." More guests were arriving now. Some glanced in their direction. A few recognized him. Cameras hovered, uncertain whether to capture this moment or pretend it wasn't happening. Sienna whispered sharp curses under her breath. "This is humiliating," she hissed. Richard didn't respond. He stood there, jaw tight, eyes locked on the ballroom. Inside, the lights dimmed. Music began. A spotlight hit the stage, and there she was, Lena. She stepped up to the microphone. Applause erupted. Richard watched through the glass as she addressed the room with a grace he had almost forgotten. Her voice, though muffled, was warm, clear, steady. She smiled, gestured, made them laugh. Not polite laughter, real, deep, admiring laughter. And for a moment, a flicker of memory surfaced, those old galas. She used to stand beside him, silent, smiling, content to let him speak. Always quiet. Not anymore. Now she was leading, commanding, owning the moment in a way that made the very air around her seem heavier. The cameras outside shifted. One lens turned toward Richard and Sienna. Click, click, flash. And just like that, the moment was immortalized. A man denied. A woman reborn. Richard stepped back, his feet moved before his thoughts did. Sienna followed, furious. "Where are we going?" she demanded. He didn't answer. He couldn't. It felt like the world had closed a door and drawn the curtain, as if he had once starred in a play and was now watching it from the alleyway. Back inside, the gala continued. And outside, beneath velvet ropes, beside polished marble, Richard Langford finally realized something he had never considered. You can buy access. You can buy attention. But you cannot buy respect. That has to be earned. And Lena Monroe had earned it in silence, built it in shadows, and delivered it with a nod that echoed louder than any insult. And now she didn't even have to look at him to remind him what he had lost. She had already made her point, and the city was watching. Richard Langford couldn't sleep. He stood in the dark, the skyline of New York stretching out before him, glittering, indifferent. His glass sat untouched on the windowsill. The events of the gala looped in his mind with brutal clarity. Every detail sharper now than it had been in real time. The way the crowd had laughed when Lena opened the night with a warm anecdote about legacy and compassion. The effortless grace with which she acknowledged her partners and donors, names he used to command, who now hung on her every word. The way the security guard had stood firm, calm, respectful, like someone carrying out instructions from a much higher authority. But worst of all, the look in Lena's eyes. Not anger. Not pity, just distance. It had all been calculated, every inch of it, but not with malice. That was what shattered him the most, that it wasn't about him. Her silence, her rise, her power, none of it had anything to do with him anymore. She wasn't responding, she was rising. She hadn't staged a takedown. She didn't need one. She simply chose who belonged. And he hadn't made the cut. By the next morning, the media was ablaze. Not the traditional outlets. They kept a sheen of restraint for the city's elite. But the bloggers, the gossip accounts, the viral handles with millions of followers, the hashtags were relentless. Langford locked out when she runs the room, not on the list. Some posts were cruel, others too clever for their own good. But the worst? A 10-second video clip that went viral. Richard, standing still, hands in his pockets, staring through the ballroom glass at Lena as she spoke. The angle, perfect, too perfect. It almost felt staged, like the universe itself had waited for this moment to click into place. A frozen frame of consequence. Sienna, humiliated and livid, was packing her bags by noon. "This is not what I signed up for," she said, shoving heels into a designer duffel. "I didn't leave everything to become a meme." Richard didn't argue. He didn't even try to explain, because the truth, he didn't blame her. Not anymore. She had always been honest, ambitious, brazen, sometimes shallow, but honest. She wanted power, visibility, status, and for a while she had those things. But now they were dissolving, not because of a scandal but because of something quieter, more dangerous. Irrelevance. And now those things were slipping from Richard's grasp like water from a cracked glass. "You know," Sienna said on her way out, pausing in the doorway with her jacket slung casually over her shoulder. "You used to talk about her like she didn't matter. Guess you were wrong." When the door clicked shut behind her, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt punishing. Richard Langford spent the next few days watching everything fall neatly into place, and none of it belonged to him. The Horizon Foundation's new structure was officially announced, and Lena Monroe's name was no longer a whisper behind closed boardrooms. It was front-page news. A featured op-ed in the New York Journal praised the foundation's pivot from performative philanthropy to measurable, lasting impact. Photos from the gala were everywhere. Lena in that deep navy gown, shaking hands with senators, laughing with policy influencers, commanding a podium with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove she belonged. Richard wasn't mentioned, not once. The phone calls slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Invitations vanished. Even the real estate firm that had been deep in negotiation for a joint urban development project quietly withdrew. Their official reason? An ethical branding misalignment. That word, ethical, rang in his ears like a slur. He tried to fight it. He doubled down on reports, pitched new angles, pushed his team for tighter media coverage and stronger engagement. But nothing stuck. His name had stopped opening doors. When his PR consultant finally called, her voice was low, each syllable careful, like she was choosing wires to cut. "We could consider a rebuild," she said. "A philanthropic push, something with heart. Maybe a foundation in your mother's name?" Richard didn't answer. What would be the point? Anything he did now would look like damage control, not principle. By Friday, he gave up the pretense. He canceled meetings, ignored emails, let his phone buzz endlessly into voicemail. He moved through the penthouse like a ghost, unshaven, barefoot chap, staring too long at rooms once curated for power, now echoing with absence. One night, unable to sit still, he got in the car and drove. No destination, just city lights and wind against the windows, a hollow beat in his chest. And somehow, without intending to, he ended up in the old neighborhood. The one where he and Lena used to walk hand in hand on Sundays, before ambition outpaced affection. The community center she used to volunteer at was still there. It had been repainted, bright blues and yellows, more vibrant than he remembered. Outside, two teenagers were unloading boxes from a delivery truck. One of them wore a black t-shirt with the Horizon Foundation's logo stretched across the back. Richard watched for a moment, then slowly, silently, drove away. Back at home, the city lights blinked outside his windows, indifferent, untouchable, just like her. He opened the drawer he hadn't touched in months. Tucked between an old contract and a checkbook he no longer used was a photograph. Lena, the original, not a copy. She was laughing in it, head tilted back slightly, a book clutched in her hands. He couldn't remember what they'd been talking about. Just the sound of her laugh. The look in her eyes when she used to look at him like he mattered. That version of her no longer existed. And neither did the version of himself she had once believed in. The realization came not as a jolt, but as a murmur, soft, undeniable, and suffocating. He hadn't just lost Lena, he had lost the best reflection of himself. He stood there for a long time, the photo in his hands, the skyline glowing outside his window, indifferent and unbothered. And in that silence, Richard Langford finally understood something he had never dared face. You can build towers, sign checks, host galas. But if you do it without care, without love, without truly seeing the ones beside you, the day will come when you find yourself on the outside, alone. And when it does, the doors don't slam shut. They simply never open. They nod from the balcony and keep walking. The morning after everything fell apart, the city looked unchanged. But Richard Langford did not. The sunlight streamed through his glass walls, cold and unforgiving, brushing across pristine surfaces in a home that no longer felt earned. He moved slowly, like each motion cost something. There were no emails, no strategy calls, no invites to accept. His calendar, once bloated with appointments, flights, and curated appearances, was blank. The world had continued, without him, and for the first time he truly saw that it had never needed to pause. He had believed that influence was altitude, that once you reached a certain height, you were immune to gravity. But gravity had arrived anyway, and its name was Lena Monroe. Not bitter, not vengeful, just focused, measured, and strategic. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't warned. She didn't need to. Her absence had done the speaking, and now her silence echoed louder than the applause he once engineered. The press picked up the story, not because it was scandalous, but because it meant something. Op-eds described Lena Monroe as the new face of private philanthropy. Not loud, not boastful, just visionary. Words like resilience, reinvention, legacy clung to her like honors. Richard's name? It appeared rarely, and when it did, it was an afterthought. A before picture. The final blow came from a video, clipped from inside the gala. The moment Lena concluded her speech, poised, calm, radiant, the crowd rose in a standing ovation. Some clapped, others cheered. But near the front row, as Lena turned to step away from the microphone, someone leaned over and whispered, "It's about time people saw her for who she really is." The speaker wasn't named. It didn't need explanation. The comments spread like wildfire, quoted in captions, woven into articles, painted across digital backdrops as symbols of strength and quiet defiance. It became a rallying cry. She had become something Richard never expected, iconic. He watched the video alone in his office, sunk into the same leather chair where he used to finalize multi-million-dollar deals. The screen glowed in the dim room, casting long shadows across his face as he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. He didn't know what to call the emotion moving through him. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was hollowness. The absence of power, the realization that what he had once dismissed had outgrown him, and done so with dignity. Not in a blaze of glory, not with vindictive fury, but with quiet certainty, like roots growing beneath concrete until the pavement cracks. He didn't call Lena, not because he didn't want to, but because there was nothing left to say. No apology would carry enough weight. No explanation would land without sounding defensive. And she didn't need either. She had already turned the page. It was just now realizing the book had ended. Outside, the city kept moving, honking, buzzing, breathing, unmoved by his reckoning. Richard sat still in a home that looked polished, expensive, curated, and completely, irreversibly empty. Every surface gleamed like a showroom. But none of it felt like it belonged to a person anymore. It was a mausoleum of ego. He wandered into the living room, shelves lined with trophies and accolades, all glinting under recessed lighting, testaments to a past that felt detached from any lasting value. He pulled one down. A crystal award, naming him Innovator of the Year 5 years ago. He turned it slowly in his hands, reading the etched letters like they belonged to someone else. He remembered the night he won. How Lena had stood in the crowd, silent, proud, steady. She had never needed credit, only to be seen. And he hadn't. He'd mistaken her grace for passivity, her support for dependence. Now he understood. She had always been strong. He had just been too arrogant to see it. That evening, as dusk painted the skyline in ink and gold, Richard walked the halls of his penthouse. One last time, he paused at the door of the guest room, Sienna's old studio. The air still held the faint scent of her perfume and ring light heat. He turned off the last lamp she'd left, folded it into a storage bin, and shut the door. In the kitchen, he poured himself a drink, not for celebration, not even for comfort, just to feel something real in his hand. Then, without thinking, he picked up his phone, opened a blank message. He didn't type her name, just stared at the blinking cursor, the space where words could go, but wouldn't. 1,000 things swelled in his throat, apologies, memories, regrets, but none of them crossed the threshold. They stayed inside, heavy, stubborn, unspeakable. After a moment, he turned off the screen and set the phone down. The next morning, Lena Monroe gave her first public interview in years. She spoke with calm resolve. She didn't mention Richard. She didn't dwell on the past. Instead, she talked about the future, the mission of the Horizon Foundation, the women stepping into leadership for the first time, the meaning of presence without ego. She ended the interview with one quiet line: "Power isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who can stand alone without needing to be seen." Richard watched the broadcast from the darkened corners of his home. The curtains were drawn, the lights were low. He didn't cry, he didn't shout. He just listened. And when it ended, he stood, walked to the window, opened it. The city air was sharp. It smelled of pavement and lost opportunities. He breathed it in, felt it settle into him, then stepped back into the silence. Once, he had been admired. He had been powerful. But in the end, Richard Langford wasn't undone by scandal. He wasn't crushed by headlines. He was eclipsed by a woman who had outgrown him, with elegance, with restraint, and with a single devastating nod. So the story's over, our wonderful friends. Are you still here at this hour? If you're still here, still reading, still feeling, then maybe something in this story reached into your own life and tugged at a quiet place. Maybe it reminded you of a time you were overlooked, underestimated, or walked away from, and how that silence you sat in wasn't weakness, but preparation. Lena Monroe's journey teaches us something profound, that dignity doesn't need a microphone. And true power isn't loud, it's steady. She didn't rage, she didn't seek revenge, she rebuilt, silently, strategically, and with such grace that by the time the world noticed, she had already arrived. There's a quote from Otherism that fits so perfectly here. Let them wonder where you went while you quietly become impossible to ignore. That's what Lena did. And maybe that's what you're doing too. Because healing, real healing, often happens when no one is watching. And the most remarkable kind of reinvention? It's not flashy, it's not viral. It's when you look in the mirror one day and finally recognize your own strength and no longer need anyone else to. So if you're here reading this, nodding slowly in the quiet of your room, this is your moment too. Don't rush it. Don't explain it. Just honor it. And hey, if this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or even smile with a little ache in your chest, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach others who might need them too. Let's keep telling the stories that remind us. You don't have to shout to be powerful. Sometimes you just have to stand still and let the silence speak for itself.